Before we begin, let me ask you something. How did farmers grow strong crops for thousands of years before chemical fertilizer plants, trucking networks, and multinational corporations existed? How did civilizations survive droughts, wars, and collapses without bags of nitrogen and phosphorus stacked in warehouses? If you study agricultural history long enough, you eventually run into something that feels uncomfortable for modern industry. 3,000 years ago on the Korean peninsula, farmers were already using living liquid fertilizers that built soil, increased yields, and protected crops without destroying ecosystems. These methods were passed down quietly through families and rural communities. They were never advertised. They were never patented. And in the 20th century, they were deliberately pushed aside. What you are about to learn is not folklore. It is documented agricultural practice preserved through systems now known as Korean natural farming, pioneered in modern times by Cho Han-kyu, and later expanded through groups like Jadam organic farming. At the heart of it all is a fermented liquid that replaces most commercial fertilizers when used correctly. And once you understand how it works, you will never look at modern agriculture the same way again. How ancient Korean farmers learned to feed plants without buying anything. Traditional Korean agriculture developed under constant pressure. Mountainous terrain, limited flat land, frequent wars, and harsh winters forced farmers to work with nature instead of against it. They could not afford to waste nutrients. Everything had to be recycled. Over centuries, farmers noticed something remarkable. Forests never needed fertilizer. Trees just kept growing tall, healthy, and productive year after year, with no help from people at all. The real secret, it turned out, was microbial life. Leaves would fall to the ground, ferment, and end up feeding trillions of microorganisms. These tiny workers converted all that organic matter into nutrients that plants could actually use. Korean farmers, they learned to imitate this natural process, but in liquid form. They went out, collected beneficial microbes, gave them sugar and plant material to eat, and then allowed a controlled fermentation to take place. The end result was a living nutrient solution, now known as fermented plant juice, indigenous microorganism solution, and natural farming liquid inputs. These liquids were then applied to fields, rice paddies, orchards, and home gardens. And the crops just kept growing steadily, roots reached deeper, and the soil actually improved each year instead of getting worse. So, why does this liquid approach work better than most commercial fertilizers? Well, modern fertilizer delivers nutrients in isolated chemical form. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are forced into the soil in concentrated doses. Plants do absorb some of it, but the rest just washes away, harms microbes, or even hardens the soil over time. The Korean liquid system, on the other hand, works in a completely different way. It doesn't feed the plants directly. It feeds the life in the soil. When you apply fermented plant liquid, you're introducing enzymes, organic acids, minerals, and living microorganisms. These organisms break down organic matter already in the soil and convert it into slow-release nutrition. This creates three major effects. First, nutrients become available gradually, preventing burn and waste. Second, soil structure improves, allowing better water retention and oxygen flow. Third, plant immunity strengthens because healthy microbes suppress disease. In practical terms, crops grow slower at first, then stronger and more resilient over time. What the 3,000-year-old liquid is actually made from. The core formula is simple, which is why it survived for millennia. Farmers traditionally harvested fast-growing plants such as comfrey, mugwort, bamboo shoots, pumpkin vines, or sweet potato leaves. These plants are nutrient accumulators. They pull minerals from deep soil layers. The fresh plant material was chopped and mixed with brown sugar or raw sugar in equal weight. The sugar draws out sap and feeds fermentation microbes. The mixture was sealed loosely and stored in a cool, shaded place for about a week. As fermentation began, liquid formed naturally. This liquid was strained and diluted heavily before use, often at ratios of 1 to 500 or 1 to 1,000. The result was a concentrated biological fertilizer that could last months when stored properly. So, let's talk about how families actually put this system to use in real farming conditions. Back during the Joseon dynasty, and even earlier, folks would use this liquid quite strategically, throughout the entire growing season. Before planting, they'd apply a diluted solution to the soil, aiming to activate those beneficial microbes. Then, during the vegetative growth phase, it was sprayed on both leaves and roots to encourage strong, healthy stems. When it came time for flowering, they'd ferment different plant materials to specifically support fruit development. For instance, squash vine ferment was used on melons, while bean leaf ferment found its place on grains. Near the coast, seaweed ferment was added to the mix, providing those all-important trace minerals. A typical household, believe it or not, kept several clay jars fermenting at different stages, almost like having a pantry full of living fertilizers. This clever system allowed small farms to stay independent, even during times of trade disruptions or famine. Now, if you're wondering how you could actually reproduce this method today, well, let me walk you through it step by step. Modern gardeners and homesteaders can still use this system with just basic materials, really. First, start by harvesting healthy, fast-growing leaves early in the morning when the sap content is at its highest. Chop them up finely. Then weigh them and mix with an equal weight of brown sugar. Finally, pack the mixture loosely into a glass or food-grade plastic container. So, you'll want to cover your mixture with a breathable cloth, or just a loose lid, really. Store it somewhere dark, and try to keep the temperature between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. After, say, 5 to 7 days, you'll notice liquid forming. At that point, strain it and store the result in sealed bottles. When you're ready to use it, dilute 1 tablespoon per gallon of water. Apply it to the soil every 2 weeks during the growing season. And you can also spray it on the leaves, but do that in the early morning or evening. Over time, you'll notice the soil texture improving, roots growing deeper, and, fewer problems with pests. So, why did modern agriculture push this kind of knowledge aside? Well, after the Second World War, governments started promoting industrial farming to boost short-term yields. Chemical fertilizers were, honestly, just easier to make in large quantities, ship around and sell. Biological systems, on the other hand, were much harder to standardize or turn into a business. Universities began shifting their research funding toward these industrial inputs, and extension services stopped teaching folks about fermentation methods. Farmers were encouraged to specialize, mechanize, and really to depend more and more on external suppliers. Within 2 generations, most families forgot how to make their own soil fertility. This was not accidental. It created dependency. Why this ancient liquid matters more than ever today. Fuel prices, fertilizer shortages, and fragile supply chains are exposing the weaknesses of modern farming. When nitrogen plants shut down, crops fail. When shipping stops, food disappears. The Korean liquid system offers resilience. It requires no factories, no imports, no debt, only knowledge and discipline. For survivalists, homesteaders, and serious growers, this is not nostalgia. It is strategic independence. Once you build living soil, you are no longer at the mercy of markets. Why preserving this knowledge is now your responsibility. Every generation that loses practical agricultural knowledge becomes more vulnerable. 3,000 years of refinement can disappear in one lifetime. By learning and using these methods, you are not just improving your garden. You are preserving a survival system that outlasted empires. If this kind of forgotten history and real-world skill matters to you, make sure you subscribe, share this video with others who value self-reliance, and help keep this knowledge alive for the next generation.